Gorlap was sick of this wretched war. 10 stinking cycles he'd spent on this godforsaken planet, and for what? So far, all the Planetary Defense Force had managed to accomplish was to throw away the lives of a couple million galactic youth. He wouldn't even be here if the planet belonged to a minor race like the Calkaks, and he was sure that if his own race had been attacked, then they'd have been left to fend for themselves. But no. This planet belonged to a council race, and so half the galaxy had been obliged to send help. That was how he'd ended up in the bottom of this muddy trench, on a planet halfway across the galaxy from home. Gorlap's unit had only taken up residence on the front line mere hours ago, after a suspiciously long stay in the support trenches. A lot of his units were replacements fresh from boot camp, and a few were so young they still had fur on their backs. This was going to be a tough stay on the front line. Gorlap's platoon was on the very left flank of the entire battalion, which meant that in the next trench over was the right flank of a battalion of Calkaks. Gorlap disliked Calkaks. Of course, no one could question their battlefield prowess. But their shit was universally recognized as the foulest in the galaxy, and often a stray artillery shell would send it raining into the surrounding trenches. Gorlap hoped that maybe on this deployment the Calkaks would do a better job of sending their waste back through the support trenches, and away from him. A piercing whistle sliced through the air, and Gorlap had only a split second to dive for cover. There was a cataclysmic explosion, and his whole existence was replaced by rending noise and putrid smoke. There was a terrible wailing, and after having recovered his faculties, Gorlap saw Zack clutching his thorax as a wad of plasma burned a hole through his carapace. Looking around at the rest of the trench, Gorlap felt his mandibles slacken in relief. The trench shields had managed to deflect the worst of a direct hit. "What the hell was that, Sarge? I thought these shields were supposed to be impervious," cried a nearby private. "Nothing's impervious," Gorlap replied. "Someone get Zack to the field hospital." Gorlap returned to his seat on the firing step. "10 days of frontline duty was enough to send any sentient mad. This was day 11. For the past hour there had been a merciful lull in the enemy's shielding, just long enough for one of the battalion's lieutenants to crawl out of his bunker. Gorlap jumped to his feet and saluted. "Sir." "As you were, Sergeant," said the lieutenant. "I have some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that we're going to be staying on the front line for the foreseeable future. The enemy have opened up a second front on the eastern continent, and the PDF needs everyone they can." Gorlap was devastated. "What's the good news, sir?" "The Calkaks on our left flank are one of the requisitioned units." "Oh, thank the divines for that. I'm getting tired of their reign. Who's replacing them?" "A battalion of humans." "Humans? Here?" Gorlap laughed nervously. There was a sinking feeling in the pit of his Zimphna. He'd met humans before, might even call a couple of them friends. They made good engineers and even better drinking buddies, but their soft fleshy bodies didn't seem very good for combat. "Does Command deem that wise?" "We're fighting a losing war. Command's desperate for manpower," replied the lieutenant. "I expect one of the human intelligence officers will want to know how things are on this part of the front. See to it that they get a full report." "What about you, sir? Aren't you in a better position to brief the humans?" The lieutenant gave him a derisive look and returned to his bunker. Captain Gomez of the 12th South American Army Corps was polite and professional, if a bit reticent. His omelette armor was woodland camouflaged, and the unit patch on the front of her helmet had a picture of a wooden club with black spikes coming out of it. Gorlap didn't mind reticence in an officer. Better to have a quiet and competent leader than a foolhardy glory seeker. Using some pre-war satellite photography, he showed the human the positions where the enemy trenches now lay, and then, with the aid of a periscope, he showed her how the landscape has since changed then. In the dirt wall of the trench, he made a diagram of the enemy's defences, and pointed out a few suspected weak points in their line. He even went so far as to suggest sending a couple of scouting parties in the night, if the humans were looking for a bit of action. She declined, saying that unless orders came from above, she wouldn't be sending anybody into no man's land. Gorlap had never heard that phrase before, but he liked it. It was an apt description for that strip of wasteland between the trenches. "How are supplies brought to the front line?" she asked. "Handler droids move munitions and rations through tubes that are dug into the ground. Anything bigger than that is brought up manually through the support trenches. I trust our logistical needs, especially our higher water requirements compared to other species, are on their radar?" "I wouldn't worry about that, ma'am. The logistical battalions are usually pretty good at getting stuff to the front line. Getting waste away is where they tend to falter." "Is that why we're up to our ankles in Calkak shit?" she asked. "We thought that maybe they had some sort of grudge against humans." "No, they're just Armoks." "Armoks?" "Barnyard animals, dirty and disgusting." "Ah, we've got a similar saying. They're like pigs." "Well, thank you very much for your assistance, Sergeant. It's been invaluable." "It was no burden, ma'am." "You just keep a watch on our right flank and we'll watch your left." She smiled. "Platoon, gather round," announced Gorlap. 30 soldiers shuffled towards him. Some of them had been writing letters to their families, some had been cooking over makeshift campfires, and all of them were exhausted. 3 weeks on the front line would do that to a person. Even the most eager of replacements were now grizzled veterans, and most hadn't even fired a shot yet. "Word just came in from the rear echelon. Zach didn't make it. Died of his wounds last night." If the platoon was shaken, they didn't show it. They were too battle-tired to show any kind of emotion. "Corporal, I'm putting you in charge of the auction of his belongings. See to it that his widow receives the proceeds." "Yes, Sarge." Your first artillery barrage was always the worst. The entire world seemed to tear itself apart, and the dirt around your trench boiled in plasma. The thin veneer of civilization slipped away, and all that was left was terror. You couldn't imagine how things could possibly get worse. This was surely hell itself. And then you lived through your second artillery barrage, and you realized that somehow it was even worse. And then your third, and your fourth. Every single time it was the worst you'd ever lived through. This was the worst artillery barrage that Gorlap had ever endured. The enemy must have realized how long they had been on the front without relief. They must be planning an assault. The earth shook violently under the relentless pounding of enemy fire, each explosion a reminder of their precarious situation. The sky was ablaze with green flashes. Gorlap, crouched in his trench, could feel the fear and tension gripping his platoon. Yet, amidst the deafening roar and terror, a new sound began to rise. It started as a low hum, almost drowned out by the sound of explosions, but steadily grew in volume and confidence. The human soldiers had begun to sing. Their voices, filled with a strange mix of defiance and hope, cut through the cacophony of war. The song was unfamiliar to Gorlap, a lively melody that spoke of far-off lands and loved ones waiting for their return. It was a stark contrast to the despair all around them. "It's a long way to Venezuela. It's a long way to go. It's a long way to Venezuela, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye to Caracas, farewell Bolivar Square. It's a long, long way to Venezuela, but my heart's right there." Gorlap watched in awe as the humans continued to sing, their faces set in determined lines, their eyes alight with an unquenchable spirit. He saw his own soldiers, initially bewildered, slowly start to draw strength from this display of resilience. The atmosphere in the trench shifted subtly, from one of impending doom to a more resolute stance. They were still outnumbered and outgunned, but they were no longer just survivors waiting for the end. They were soldiers, fighting for something greater than themselves. The last shell exploded, and a sudden silence fell over the battlefield, as if the world itself was stunned by the audacity of hope in such a hopeless place. Gorlap felt a surge of admiration for these human soldiers, who could find the strength to sing in the face of death. Gorlap sat up straight on his perch and looked out onto no man's land. The landscape was scarred and barren. Not even plant matter could survive outside the trench's shields. If the humans can sing so cheerfully in such a hellish place as this, Gorlap thought, then I can afford to keep a good watch. And with that thought, he settled in, his eyes scanning the horizon. The war was far from over, but for now, they had weathered the storm. And that was something worth holding on to.